My name is Nora Callet. I am 33 years old. And the Sunday morning my father stood at a christening brunch in a hotel dining room in Savannah and told 27 members of my family that I had been removed from every document he had ever signed was the morning I finally understood that the most dangerous thing a person can do is assume that the only copy is the one they are holding. He did not wait for the food to be served. He stood before the first course arrived, tapped the side of his water glass with a dinner knife, and said, in the voice he used when he had decided something irrevocable, "Before we celebrate today, I think this family should know where things stand." My stepmother, Renata, set her napkin across her lap with a small practice motion of someone who had been briefed. Nora made her choice, my father said. So now she gets nothing. I lifted my coffee cup with both hands and looked at the window. Outside, the December light was coming in flat and silver off the river. A tour boat was moving slowly along the waterfront, nearly empty at that hour. I watched it, and I did not speak, and I did not set the cup down until my hands were steady, which took approximately 4 seconds. What none of the 27 people in that room knew, not my father, not Renata, not my brother Daniel, whose son's christening this was supposed to be, was that 2 floors below us, in the smaller private dining room the hotel used for morning events that had already finished, a woman named Cecile Marsh was eating a late breakfast before driving back to her office in Atlanta. Cecile Marsh was a notary public commissioned in the state of Georgia. 8 months earlier, she had placed her seal on a document in a law office on Bull Street, and that document was not the version my father had just announced to the room. I knew she was in the building because I had called her the previous Tuesday and asked her to be. I want to tell you about my father before I tell you about what he did, because the shape of a person matters more than the worst thing they have ever done, and I have spent 3 years trying to hold both of those things at once without letting one erase the other. My father's name is Gerald Callet. He is 64 years old. He built a commercial real estate appraisal business over 30 years in Savannah, not large, not glamorous, but steady in the way that unglamorous things can be steady, the kind of business that generates reliable fees and a reputation for accuracy, and not much else. He is not a cruel man by nature. He is a man who, late in life, made one significant decision that reorganized everything that came after it. When I was 26, my father married Renata Voss. She was 51 at the time, recently widowed, with 2 adult children of her own from her first marriage. I did not object to the marriage. I attended the ceremony, I was courteous to Renata, and I spent the first 2 years of their marriage being what I can only describe as deliberately inoffensive, arriving at family events on time, asking appropriate questions, not raising the subject of my mother, who had died when I was 19 and whose absence I had learned to carry in a way that did not require management from other people. What I had not fully understood at the time was that Renata was, among her other qualities, a person who experienced the existence of prior attachments as a form of competition. She did not say this directly. She communicated it through a series of small adjustments, suggestions about holiday timing, observations about how certain traditions might be updated, a consistent pattern of framing my father's history before her as a period that was better understood as prologue. She did it without visible seams, which is a skill I can acknowledge without admiring. My father, for his part, was in the particular condition of a man who had been lonely for several years before Renata and was therefore inclined to interpret her preferences as wisdom. He loved her. I believe that genuinely. He also, over the course of about 3 years, began to see his life before her through her eyes, which is a different thing than loving someone and considerably more consequential. I watched it happen incrementally. A missed birthday call, explained by a scheduling conflict. A change to the holiday arrangement, presented as a practical matter. A comment at Easter. The first year that Renata's children were included in the gathering, and I was told the seating had become difficult, that I had never really made an effort to fit in with the new family structure. I remember where I was standing when he said that. I remember the particular quality of light in his kitchen and the sound of Renata in the adjacent room, and the way I kept my expression level and said, "I understand." Because I did understand. I simply understood something different than what he meant. I am an accountant. I have been a CPA for 8 years, working primarily in estate and trust accounting at a firm in Atlanta. I mention this because it is relevant to everything that follows, and also because I want to be precise about what I did and did not know at each point in this sequence. I knew, by the time of the christening, the following things about my father's estate. His primary asset was the appraisal business, valued at a recent estimate of approximately $1,340,000, a figure I arrived at through standard methods applied to his disclosed revenue, client base, and equipment, not because I had access to his private financials, but because I had spent 8 years doing this kind of work and could read the public record well enough to construct a reasonable picture. He owned the house in which he and Renata lived, a property on Habersham Street that I knew from county records was titled jointly with right of survivorship, which meant it would pass to Renata regardless of what anyone said. He had an investment account, the value of which I did not know precisely, but which I understood to be moderate. He had, as of 3 years prior, retained a Savannah estate attorney to draft a new will following his marriage to Renata. I knew this because he had told me himself at the time, in a phone call that I had found reassuring in its transparency. He said the new will reflected his current family and that he wanted me to know where things stood. He said my name was in it. He said the division was fair. What I did not know, until 14 months before the christening, was that a second version had been drafted. I found out the way most people find out things they were not supposed to know, through an accident of proximity. I was in Savannah for a weekend visit, one of the 4 or 5 I made each year, enough to maintain a relationship without subjecting either of us to its full weight, and I had arrived early at the house while my father was still out. Renata was in the kitchen. I was in the front hallway, hanging my coat, when I heard her on the phone. She was not speaking quietly, which I took to mean she did not know I had come in. She was speaking to someone she called Marcus, in the tone of someone confirming an arrangement. She said, "The amendment is ready to file," and then she said, "He signed it yesterday," and then she said something I did not catch because I had stopped moving and the blood in my ears was making a noise. I hung my coat. I went into the kitchen and said hello. Renata finished the call with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to managing interruptions, and neither of us mentioned what I had heard, and the weekend proceeded with its ordinary surface intact. On the drive back to Atlanta on Sunday evening, I called my own attorney. Her name is Deborah Yancey, and she is the person I would recommend to anyone who needs a lawyer and does not want to be comforted, only helped. I told her what I had heard. She asked me 2 questions: whether my name appeared on any existing document I had physical access to, and whether I had ever seen the original will. The answer to the first question was no. The answer to the second was yes. My father had shown it to me 3 years prior, briefly at the kitchen table, and I had seen my name in the beneficiary clause. I had not taken a copy. Deborah said, "All right. Here's what we're going to do." What we did took 14 months. I want to describe it accurately rather than dramatically, because the dramatic version would compress it into a series of sharp moments and the reality was almost entirely administrative. Deborah contacted the probate court and the county recorder's office to identify what documents, if any, had been filed under my father's name. An estate planning attorney is not required to file a will during a testator's lifetime. The document lives in a drawer or a safe until it is needed, but related instruments sometimes surface. A trust, a transfer on death designation, a deed amendment. She found a deed amendment filed 7 months after my arrival in Savannah, transferring the Habersham Street property into a revocable trust. The trust document itself was not public, but the filing established that instruments existed. She also contacted the original drafting attorney, the Savannah firm my father had used 3 years earlier, and asked, in the careful language that attorneys use with each other, whether the client had returned to update his documents. The attorney, whose name I will not include here because she was not a participant in anything that followed, said she could not discuss client matters but suggested that Deborah might wish to confirm whether her client's interests were addressed in any current instrument. That was enough. Deborah engaged a Savannah associate, a man named Terrence Obie, to begin the formal groundwork for a will contest, contingent on what any filed document said at the time it became relevant. The contest could not be filed while my father was living. That is not how will contests work, but the preparation could be done. The research, the documentation of the original instrument, the evidence of my standing as a named beneficiary under the prior version. The prior version, it turned out, could be established through one specific and very useful fact. The notary who had witnessed and sealed the original will was a woman named Cecile Marsh, who maintained meticulous records of every notarization she had performed and who was, under Georgia law, permitted to confirm the existence and date of a notarization she had witnessed without disclosing its contents. Deborah contacted her. Cecile confirmed the date, the parties present, and the document type. She did not confirm what the document said. She did not need to. The existence of a witnessed will, dated 3 years prior and never revoked on record, was the foundation we needed. 8 months before the christening, Deborah filed a protective notice with a probate court. Not a contest, not a claim, simply a filing that put the court on notice that an interested party had standing concerns regarding a specific testator's estate instruments. It was a quiet filing. My father would not have seen it unless he was looking. He was not looking. I asked Cecile, in a phone call the week before the christening, whether she would be willing to be present in Savannah that Sunday, not in the dining room, not as a participant, simply available if her presence was needed to confirm her records to a third party. She said she was visiting family in Savannah that weekend in any case. She said she would be at the hotel where the brunch was being held for a morning event of her own. She said she would stay for breakfast afterward. I said that was very convenient. She said, "It is, isn't it?" The christening itself was at a church on Abercorn Street. My nephew, whose name is James and who is 3 months old and entirely unaware of the administrative significance of the morning, was dressed in a white gown that had belonged to my father's mother and managed the water with the mild surprise of a person encountering cold for the first time. I held him briefly in the church entryway while Daniel and his wife spoke to the priest, and James looked at me with the absolute focused attention of infants, which I have always found clarifying. We moved to the hotel at 11. The private dining room was on the 3rd floor, with tall windows that faced the river and a long table set for 28. The hotel staff had arranged small centerpieces of white roses and eucalyptus. The tablecloths were ivory. It was a room that had been designed to mark occasions, and it did its job well. I was seated toward the middle of one side of the table. Renata was at my father's right. Daniel and his wife were at the head. The room had the specific energy of a gathering in which everyone has been in a church together recently, slightly quieter than usual, not quite formal, the voices still calibrated to an interior space larger than where they now were. My father stood before the first course arrived. I have described what he said. I want to add one detail that I did not include in the opening, because it belongs here rather than there. When he finished speaking, he sat down and Renata placed her hand over his on the tabletop, and he turned to look at her with an expression I recognized as gratitude. He was grateful that she had helped him do something he found difficult. I understood that. It did not change what I did next, but I understood it. I lifted my coffee cup with both hands and looked at the window. The tour boat on the river had stopped at a dock. Someone on the upper deck was taking a photograph of something I could not see from where I sat. I watched until the boat moved again, and then I set the cup down, and I took my phone from my bag and sent a single text message to Deborah Yancey, who was in Atlanta, which read, "It happened. Proceed." And then I put my phone away and accepted the first course, which was a corn chowder that the hotel did very well. Deborah called Terrence Obie, who was at his office in Savannah on a Sunday because I had asked him to be available, and he was the kind of attorney who treated availability as a professional standard rather than an imposition. Terrence called the hotel and asked to speak with Cecile Marsh, who was finishing her breakfast in the smaller dining room on the first floor. Cecile confirmed to Terrence, on a recorded call, the existence and date of the notarized will she had witnessed, and confirmed that to her knowledge no revocation instrument bearing her notarization had been executed. Terrence then drafted a letter, he had the template ready, addressed to my father's estate planning attorney, with a copy to the Chatham County Probate Court, formally notifying both parties that a prior-in-time witnessed testamentary instrument existed, that an interested beneficiary had established standing, and that any subsequently executed instrument purporting to modify or revoke the prior will would be subject to formal contest at the time of probate. The letter was sent by certified mail that afternoon. My father received it on Tuesday. I want to be precise about what the letter did and did not do, because I think accuracy matters more than impression in this particular sequence. The letter did not invalidate any document my father had signed. A person has the right to amend or revoke a will during their lifetime. The letter did not contest that right. What it did was establish, formally and on record, that any such amendment would face a documented challenge at the time it became relevant, which is to say, after my father's death, and that the challenge was not speculative, but grounded in a specific prior instrument witnessed by a named notary whose records were on file. What the letter effectively communicated, to anyone who understood estate law, was that the amendment my father had signed was not clean. It was contestable, and a contested will is expensive, time-consuming, and public. My father called me on Wednesday. It was the first time he had called me in 4 months. He said, "I got a letter." I said, "I know." He said, "Nora." I said, "Dad, I'm not going to argue about it. I'm not going to explain it. I have an attorney and she has filed what she has filed, and that is where things stand." There was a long silence. I could hear the particular ambient sound of his office, the hum of the HVAC system, a phone ringing somewhere in the building and being picked up by someone else. He said, "Renata is very upset." I said, "I imagine she is." He said, "This isn't what I wanted." I said, "I know it isn't. But what I wanted was to be treated as though I existed in this family, and that didn't seem to be available, so I worked with what was." Another silence. Longer. He said, "I didn't think you'd." "I know you didn't," I said. "I think that's worth understanding." I did not say anything else. I told him I had to get back to work, which was true, and I ended the call, and I sat in my car in the parking structure adjacent to my office building for approximately 7 minutes before I went inside. What followed over the next 8 months was not dramatic in the way that people expect when they hear the word consequences. There was no single scene of reversal. There was instead a sequence of adjustments that accumulated into a different arrangement. My father retained a second estate attorney, a firm in Atlanta this time, recommended by a colleague of Renata's, to review the amendment and assess its defensibility. That review took 6 weeks and cost, by my estimate, somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 in legal fees. The review concluded, apparently, that the contest risk was real because the amendment had been drafted without formal notice to named beneficiaries in the prior will, a procedural gap that created exposure. The second firm recommended mediation. Deborah and Terrence represented me. My father came with his new Atlanta attorney. Renata was not present, which I noted and did not remark on. The mediation took 1 full day in a conference room in a building on Peachtree Street with windows that looked out over a parking deck, which is the least atmospheric setting I can imagine for conversation about inheritance, and also possibly the most honest. The outcome of the mediation was a restructured instrument, not a victory for me, not a restoration of the original, but a document that acknowledged my standing as a beneficiary and specified a fixed bequest, the sum of $215,000 to be drawn from the investment account, with the remainder of the estate structured as my father and his attorney had intended. It was not what the original will had suggested. It was considerably more than nothing. I signed it. My father signed it. The Atlanta attorney and Deborah co-signed as witnesses. Terrence was on the phone. When it was over, my father and I stood in the corridor outside the conference room for a moment while our respective attorneys gathered their materials. He said, "I didn't handle this well." I said, "No." He said, "I don't know how to fix it." I said, "I don't think that's actually the question right now. The question is whether you want to know me going forward. That's a separate thing from the document." He looked at the floor. He is a tall man, my father, and when he looks at the floor, it is a more visible gesture than it would be on someone shorter. He said, "I do want that." I said, "Then we can work on it." I did not hug him. I was not ready for that. I shook his hand, which is something we had not done since I was perhaps 12 years old, and it felt both strange and right, the way formal gestures can feel when they are the most honest thing available. Renata did not attend the next family gathering, which was Easter at Daniel's house in Savannah, 7 months after the mediation. My father said she had a conflict. I did not ask what the conflict was. Daniel's wife, whose name is Priya and who had witnessed the christening brunch and said nothing to me about it until now, handed me a glass of wine when I arrived and said, quietly, "For what it's worth, I thought what he did was wrong." I said thank you, and I meant it, and we did not discuss it further, and the afternoon was pleasant in the uncomplicated way that afternoons can be when the thing that needed saying has finally been said, however briefly, by someone other than the person it happened to. My nephew James was 10 months old at Easter. He had learned to pull himself upright on furniture, and was deeply committed to this as an activity. I spent a significant portion of the afternoon sitting on the floor beside him while he gripped the edge of a coffee table and regarded the middle distance with the expression of a person solving a significant problem. It seemed like the most important thing happening in the room, so I stayed. My father and I speak on the phone approximately twice a month now. The calls are not long, 20 minutes, sometimes less. We talk about work, about James, occasionally about Savannah. We do not talk about Renata much, and we do not talk about the mediation, and we have reached the particular arrangement that families sometimes reach after a significant rupture. Not repaired, exactly, but functional. Present. Neither of us pretending that the other one is not there. It is not the relationship I would have chosen. It is the relationship that was possible given what both of us are willing to do, which I have come to understand is how most relationships work, including the good ones. Cecile Marsh sent me a card in the spring. It was a simple card, the kind with a generic landscape on the front, a marsh scene, which I appreciated in a way that felt slightly too on the nose given her name, and inside, she had written only, "Glad the records were useful. Good luck going forward." I put it on the small bulletin board above my desk at the office, where it remains. Deborah Yancey charged me $7,400 for the full engagement. I paid it in 2 installments and sent her a bottle of very good Bordeaux at Christmas, which she acknowledged with a 2-word email. Excellent choice. I have enormous respect for people who are economical with their words and mean all of them. The hotel in Savannah, the one where the christening brunch was held, has a small courtyard garden accessible from the lobby. I know this because I went back 6 months after that Sunday for a work trip to Savannah and a estate audit at a firm on Bay Street, and stayed 2 nights. On the second evening, I walked through the lobby and into the courtyard, which had a fountain and a few iron chairs and a fig tree that had no business being that large in December. I sat in one of the chairs for a while. The fountain made the sound that fountains make, which is not silence, but functions similarly. I thought about the dining room 2 floors up and the tour boat on the river, and the way my father's voice had sounded when he stood and said what he said, and I thought about Cecile Marsh finishing her breakfast downstairs and the cream envelope in her bag, and I thought about the text I had sent to Deborah it happened. Proceed. And how long I had carried those 2 words before I needed them. I did not feel vindicated sitting in that courtyard. I want to be accurate about that. What I felt was something closer to the feeling after a long and complicated project is finally closed, not elation, not relief exactly, more the particular quality of a task that has been completed correctly and can now be filed. I filed it. I went back inside. I had an early call in the morning. A document filed in silence speaks longer than anything said at a table. That is the thing I would tell someone in the position I was in 3 years ago, standing in my father's hallway hearing a phone call I was not supposed to hear. Not what to do with it, that depends on specifics. I cannot know. But the principle, what is put in writing, witnessed, sealed, and filed outlasts everything else. The announcement at a dining room table is theater. The document in the probate court is fact. I had spent 8 years working with estates, and I understood that intellectually before I understood it personally, and understanding it personally is different in the way that all true understanding is different from its preliminary version. My father announced at a christening brunch that I no longer existed on paper. What he did not know was that a different version of that paper had been witnessed and sealed 8 months before he stood up to speak, and that the woman who sealed it was finishing her breakfast 2 floors below. That document cost him 6 weeks of legal review, 1 day of mediation, and whatever it costs a person to look at their daughter across a conference room table and understand that she had been more prepared than he had assumed. I do not know what the christening means to James, who is 3 months old and is now nearly 2 and has opinions about trucks that he expresses at volume. I hope it means the white gown and the cold water and the people who gathered because he had arrived. I hope it means nothing about the administrative events in the 3rd floor dining room. He will know someday, probably. Most things come out eventually. I want to ask you one thing before you go because I think you stayed through this story for a reason, and I am curious what that reason is. At the mediation, one room, one table, two attorneys, my father and me, there was a moment, about 4 hours in, when the Atlanta attorney stepped out to take a call, and Deborah went to get coffee, and it was just my father and me on opposite sides of the table with the parking deck visible through the window behind him. He looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back and neither of us said anything. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Here is what I want to ask you. What do you think he was trying to say in those 30 seconds? Not what he should have said. What do you think he was actually trying to say, given everything you now know about him? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new story posts every week. Thank you for being here.